Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Nora Gutzman. I work as a senior advisor at the Danish Institute for Human Rights in the area of business and human rights. And what we will talk about in this presentation is some of the key points for social impact assessment practitioners, or let's say environmental and social impact assessment practitioners, to consider from a human rights perspective. So for example, when taking steps to integrate human rights into an environmental, social and health impact assessment. For those of you where this is a very new topic, just to give a little bit of context of why we're talking about the topic of human rights and impact assessment. So in 2011, the United Nations Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is now considered to be the leading framework internationally in terms of setting the expectations of states, but also businesses with regard to how human rights impacts should be addressed and managed in business contexts. In terms of the expectations of companies, broadly speaking, the UN Guiding Principles set an expectation that businesses respect human rights throughout their operations. And they are expected to do this by implementing a process of human rights due diligence. Now, this includes things such as a policy commitment, assessing their human rights impacts, integrating and acting upon the findings of that assessment, as well as, of course, tracking, monitoring, communicating and reporting about their due diligence efforts, as well as the particular human rights impacts and how those are being addressed. Cross-cutting themes in this are stakeholder engagement and grievance mechanisms. So before we launch into maybe some of the key points for SIA practitioners in considering human rights in their practice, it's important, I think, to just reflect on, well, what actually would a human rights impact assessment look like, or what are some of the key considerations in a human rights impact assessment? And here I wanted to share with you these 10 criteria that we have developed as part of a human rights impact assessment guidance and toolbox. And broadly speaking, there are 5 process principles and 5 content principles. Now, to emphasize that the way that we derived these principles is through a lot of practical experience and extensive literature reviews of what is considered to be good and best practice in social impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, and also literature on the human rights-based approach to development. So these are not simply pulled out of thin air, but they are a combination of a range of factors that were consistent across those different frameworks. So if we first look at process, here we have a couple of key principles. One of them is, of course, participation. So participation of rights holders, but also duty bearers and other relevant stakeholders in the impact assessment. And there is an expectation that participation takes part throughout the whole impact assessment process. So not just at very isolated points in time, but really that those stakeholders are also engaged, for example, in initial scoping and the formulation of the focus of the impact assessment itself, for example. Related to that is the principle of non-discrimination. So when we're designing these participation methods or the structure of the impact assessment, it's important to consider, well, who are the potentially vulnerable, marginalized rights holders in that particular context, and how can we ensure that they can meaningfully participate in the impact assessment? So this focus on non-discrimination and associated with that any type of capacity building that might be necessary for rights holders to participate in a meaningful way is really key in a human rights impact assessment context, or in an impact assessment that is undertaken with human rights principles in mind. The last 2 important principles from a process perspective are accountability and transparency. So transparency obviously key throughout the process, as well as with regard to the outcome or the findings. And we can also think of transparency as being a bit more dynamic, of course, than just publishing, for example, the report at the end. We expect dialogue, for example, throughout the impact assessment process to make sure that people are continually informed about where things are at, what the key findings are, how their views have been reflected or have influenced the impact assessment process. In terms of accountability, some key things that we can look at are, of course, resourcing. If the impact assessment is not resourced, nothing works, and that really is a key point in terms of ensuring accountability. But it's also important that, from an accountability perspective, that the impact assessment recognises the entitlements of rights holders and distinguishes those from the responsibilities of different responsible parties, if you like, in the impact assessment. So that can be the main company for which the impact assessment is undertaken, but it also includes, for example, government actors that have a role to play in that particular context. Looking then at the 5 principles that have been put together in terms of the content. The first one, of course, is that human rights standards and principles need to constitute the benchmark or a benchmark for the impact assessment. The second one is that the scope of impacts needs to include those impacts that the business causes directly, but also those impacts that the business might contribute to. So here we're looking, for example, at cumulative impacts. And lastly, those types of impacts that the business is directly linked to through, for example, its operations, products and services. And this is where the focus on supply chain management and interaction with other relevant third parties comes in, which is a very key focus at the moment in business and human rights. And that is something that is emphasized in the UN Guiding Principles. It also means that things such as legacy issues, for example, are definitely considered in the impact assessment. Another point in content is that the impacts should be assessed in terms of their severity on human rights, or the severity of the human rights consequences. And here it's important that we consider the views and also the particular circumstances that the rights holders find themselves in, and as to why a particular impact might be severe for them or not. And it's also important to consider the interrelatedness between different human rights, but also between, for example, environmental, social and human rights considerations. So here, if we think of an example in the environment, if we think about a project's interaction with rivers or waterways, for example, of course, there are key environmental implications, but there are also key human rights implications. For example, in terms of the right of communities to have access to safe drinking water and adequate sanitation. So to consider those interrelatedness types of factors in an evaluation of severity is important. The last 2 criteria to consider in terms of content are that the mitigation hierarchy should be applied, which is very similar also to environmental and social impact assessment. So certainly a focus, in the first order in terms of avoiding impacts, then to mitigate any outstanding impacts, and only then to look at remediation and compensation, really as a last resort. So avoiding impacts should always be the first priority. Another factor from a human rights perspective is that impacts should not be offset. So there is a very strong recognition in the guiding principles that businesses have a responsibility to address all of their human rights impacts, and they cannot offset certain harms to human rights by doing good, for example, through some community development projects in another sphere. They have to focus on adverse impacts in their core business and make sure that all of those are effectively and comprehensively addressed. And the last criteria is around access to remedy. So this is about saying that we should consider what types of access to remedy in the project context are effective. Can rights holders access those? Where do, for example, judicial mechanisms sit in our baseline study, and what can we say about those? But also to see, well, is there a project level grievance mechanism in place? And is that accessible for those that are being impacted by the project, as well as those who are participating in the impact assessment itself? So for those of you who are already impact assessment practitioners, of course, some of these criteria will seem very familiar. Social impact assessment also, for example, of course, places a high emphasis on participation, including with vulnerable groups. It also places an emphasis on aspects such as transparency, on avoiding impacts over, for example, simply going straight to compensating those, etc. So not all of those criteria are new, and not all of them are exclusive or explicit to the practice of human rights impact assessment, because of course human rights impact assessment also as a methodology draws on all the established principles and practices that have been developed through, for example, environmental and social impact assessment. But then if we look at all of these 10 criteria that we have outlined here, there are some which perhaps need some additional consideration when social impact assessment practitioners are starting to work with human rights in their practice. And some of these I'll go into a little bit more detail about now. So the first key point is around the distinguishing between rights holders and duty bearers in stakeholder analysis. So it's essential from a human rights perspective that in the stakeholder mapping and the stakeholder analysis, we draw particular attention to different rights holders in the project context. So that can be workers, impacted communities, specific subgroups within those impacted communities, and to see are there any specific rights that are associated with that rights holder group. So for example, Indigenous people's rights, the particular rights of women and children, for example. And likewise, the stakeholder analysis should consider in detail, well, who are the duty bearers or the responsible parties in that particular context that have a responsibility to make sure that human rights are upheld. So that includes actors such as the company, associated businesses, joint venture partners, government actors such as local government authorities, potentially public security forces. So it's important that the stakeholder mapping considers all of these different groups, as well as outlining in detail what their particular rights are for the rights holders and what the particular responsibilities are for the duty bearers. A second key point to consider from a human rights perspective is the focus on these impacts which are directly linked through business relationships. So we can say that environmental and social impact assessment practice is already quite familiar with this idea of considering impacts that the project causes or impacts that the project contributes to, for example, such as cumulative impacts. Now, those are not new to impact assessment, but this focus on directly linked impacts is something that is perhaps a little bit new from a human rights perspective, and certainly the emphasis that's placed in a human rights framework on those types of impacts is something that we should familiarize ourselves with when we're looking at integrating human rights in social impact assessment. Directly related to this consideration of directly linked impacts is that the project area of impact, if you like, might change from a human rights perspective. So if we think about environmental, social and human rights considerations and this notion in impact assessment of the project area of influence, often that is still actually largely confined to either particular geographical boundaries or to geographically proximate factors or considerations. Whereas from a human rights perspective, you would say you need to consider not, the project area of influence, but the project area of impact. So what actually are all the different impacts that might be linked to that particular operation? So if we think about migrant workers, their families at home, if we think about supply chain, transports of goods, so really this focus of broadening, I guess, the reach of the types of impacts that would be considered is a key consideration. Point number 4 is, as I already mentioned, that from a human rights perspective, it's key that any impacts on human rights are not offset through, for example, positive contributions that the business might have in another space. And here we do see a bit of a difference between, say, social impact assessment and human rights impact assessment, because, of course, good practice social impact assessment focuses on addressing adverse impacts, but there's also often a strong focus on how can we maximize benefits for communities. So, for example, through community development agreements, local content, or other strategies that projects are developing to ensure that communities actually benefit from development projects. Whereas from a human rights perspective, we do focus more heavily on addressing the adverse impacts. And part of that reasoning is that we do see that sometimes in environmental and social impact assessment, there is some implicit, if you like, offsetting that occurs. So, for example, even though there are certain adverse impacts and mitigation measures are designed to address those, there is also a lot of attention on, for example, the jobs that will be created, the economic benefits that will flow to communities, and these types of positive impacts. And sometimes in practice, we do see some, I would argue, implicit offsetting that occurs in environmental and social impact assessment. Hence, there has been this emphasis placed in human rights impact assessment on really addressing adverse impacts. Of course, the focus on addressing adverse impacts is also consistent with this understanding that businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights, so not to adversely impact on human rights. They do not have the same duties as a state, for example, to take proactive measures to ensure that human rights are fulfilled. Key point number 5 is around transparency and communication. Now, this is not new for social impact assessment practitioners, so I won't spend much time on it, but just to say that, of course, from a human rights perspective, ensuring that we have effective communication about the impact assessment process, the findings, the mitigation measures, etc., throughout the process is really key. And we cannot lose that focus on transparency and communication if we are looking to implement human rights principles in the impact assessment. Point 6 is around how can we use human rights standards and principles in impact assessment. And here there are a couple of considerations of how, for example, specific human rights content, so the normative content that makes up human rights, how that might be able to inform our impact assessment analysis, and how it might deepen or strengthen the focus on some of those issues that may or may not be included in a social impact assessment. So the first example that we have here is around labour rights. So in a standard environmental and social impact assessment, you might consider things such as the number and types of jobs that come with the project, the types of business opportunities that might be provided for local communities. Now, if you're looking at the issue of employment and labour rights from a human rights perspective, there are certain things that you would use to deepen and strengthen that analysis. So, for example, you would look at the core international labour rights conventions of the ILO. So focusing particularly on things such as forced and child labour, on freedom of association, and on non-discrimination. You might also inform the analysis by looking at other types of rights, such as those around health and safety, working conditions, wages, pay, leave. All of these are articulated in quite a lot of detail in the International Labour Rights Conventions, and some of that detail can help to deepen our analysis of labour rights in an impact assessment context. And again, we have this factor of interrelatedness. So if, for example, families work excessive overtime, or if we have a very tight fly-in, fly-out schedule, for example, for certain workers, how does that impact on their right to family life, or the rights of their children, for example, to have a parent to guide them, or to playtime that they might need with their families? A second consideration of how the actual normative content of human rights might help to inform our analysis is what we call the AAAQ framework. So this is a framework that's been developed through a number of economic and social rights, particularly the right to water, education, health, and housing. And these have been broken down in international human rights law into these 4, sometimes more, criteria that outline the particular points that you would want to look at in an analysis in terms of, well, how is that right being impacted, or how is it being mitigated, or how is it being realized? So this type of analysis, again, can help us in, for example, in our baseline assessments to see, well, where are the particular gaps with regard to, say, the right to health or the right to housing from a human rights perspective. Point number 7 is around the topic of severity and significance. So usually environmental and social impact assessments evaluate impacts according to their significance. And the UN Guiding Principles instead brings in this concept of severity in order to evaluate, well, how serious, if you like, is a particular impact. Now, part of why this was introduced is to emphasize this focus in human rights on really a shift from considering risks to the business to considering risks to rights or risks to rights holders. Now, in this space, it's important to recognize that there is a lot of diversity in environmental and social impact assessment practice in terms of what are the types of factors that are included in a significance assessment, what exactly are the different terms that we use to describe, for example, the number of people or the severity or the vulnerability of rights holders. Sometimes likelihood is included, sometimes likelihood is not included. So it's a little difficult to say anything terribly definitive about, this is how we assess significance, this is how we assess severity. But I think the key point to emphasize is, again, that from a human rights perspective, you would always say that all human rights impacts need to be addressed. So all human rights impacts are actually considered significant, and they need to be addressed in the order of their severity. So which one is most serious first, then that needs to be addressed first. Whereas sometimes in environmental and social impact assessment practice, significance is used to determine, well, which impacts should be addressed, rather than necessarily discussing the order in which they should be addressed. The last key point that I wanted to emphasize is this focus that we have in the guiding principles and also in business and human rights on the concept of leverage. So leverage is considered to exist where a business has the ability to influence the actions of a third party. Now, that can be a contractually related third party, or it can be a third party where there is no contractual relationship, but where there is a linkage to that particular third party. And the guiding principles expect that companies either exercise their leverage where they have this, or to seek to maximize their ability to be able to exercise leverage. So I think this concept is relevant for us in an impact assessment context because it stresses the importance of looking at, well, what types of strategies can we use to address those impacts that the business is not causing directly, but that involve other third parties, and where we need to draw those other third parties in to address those particular impacts. So here we're talking about things like cumulative impacts, impacts in the supply chain, impacts associated with government agencies or government actors, joint venture partners, and other parties that have a key role to play in the business environment, but where the business needs to take steps to engage those parties and to work collectively to be able to address the particular impacts that have been identified.